Again, this is Kristin Hellquist with the ASAE Government Relations and Advocacy Professional Advisory Group. The speakers today and myself are part of the state and local subcommittee. I'd like to introduce our topic of how to manage and contract with state lobbyists. We have two esteemed speakers, Lorrie Trogden, and if I mispronounce anyone's name, I apologize, and Jim Leahy. They first are going to give you some background about themselves and some preliminary information. We'd like to make this session really interactive. We've planned different questions and content, but we would be happy, to hear from you all in the chat. And like I said, make this very useful and interactive to you all. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Lorrie first and then Jim, and we look forward to a great session.
Mute.
I mean, it's always somebody, Jim, and it might as well be me this time, so at least it'll look good for you. Good morning, everyone. As Kristin said, I am Lorrie Trogden, the president and CEO of the Arkansas Bankers Association. In the way of my background, I spent 8 years in corporate America in HR, and I've been in the association world for about 15 years, and I am a CAE. As far as my association goes, we're about a $1.5 million association. And we actually have banks as our members, and we have a little over 100 members. So that's our background here in the state. I am considered our head lobbyist. As far as that goes, I do manage two contract lobbyists. One is an attorney with a large law firm here in Arkansas, and he really delves into policy with me. And then I have one that is a former basketball player at our largest university, and I call him my relationship guy because he can get you a meeting with just about anybody you need to. A lot of the men around here have romances with him. So they're both very effective in their own way. I handle all of our federal lobbying. They only lobby here at the state level. And they have annual contracts with me. And even in our what we call our off years, we only have substantive sessions every other year here on the odd years. And then on the even years, it's all budgeting sessions. And because we are, not any kind of state entity, we don't really get involved in budgeting sessions unless our regulator, which is the state bank department, unless something happens with them, and I work very closely with them, we may get involved in that instance, because if something's bad for them, it's typically bad for our banks here. So that's mainly what we do and how we do it. I will say we have very strict ethics laws here. We are not allowed to pay for anything unless you can have it. You can host an entire committee. You can host the Senate chamber, the House chamber, or all of them, but that's it. There are no one-on-one dinners. You can't buy them one single drink. And so it really changes, I think, the dynamic of how we do things here. I am not a breakfast lobbyist. I take no one to breakfast. I'm not a morning person. I go out a lot at night with them when they're both in session and out of session if they're here for committee meetings. And I've really built a big camaraderie with that, especially with House and Senate leadership. And so that's how I do it here. And I will stop here. I know we've got several questions and turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Lorrie. Again, my name is Jim Leahy. I am the managing director of regional and federal programs for a public affairs firm in Cambridge, Mass. Called the Liberty Square Group. In that capacity, I am both a contract lobbyist in Connecticut for 6 or 7 clients, and I manage contract lobbyists in Connecticut as well as all of the other New England states. So I've been a lobbyist for more than 30 years, working for both nonprofit organizations, ran a government relations department for a law firm, and started with Liberty Square 6 or 7 years ago. When I look at this issue, I think what you really have to do in order to be successful with a contract lobbyist is to figure out the partnership. And I was telling Lorrie earlier that one of my first meetings back in 1989 in Connecticut with the deputy speaker after I signed my first big client, who I still have today, I asked what I should know about them before I got going. And he said they depended too much on their lobbyists, that they didn't take responsibility themselves. And that really can be problematic, to be honest. it leads to a one-way relationship and folks not knowing what's going on. I think the best thing you can do for your organization is have a firm understanding of what your abilities and assets are, and do the research necessary to figure out what lobbyist works best in the situations where you need them. But with that said, I think we've got some questions already popping up, and we can let that guide the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jim and Lorrie. And I put it in the chat, but please feel free. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we want to make this interactive. But first question, how do both of you feel about having should one member of your lobbying team be an attorney?
Well, I think I mentioned, or Jim, you go ahead. I spoke first last time.
Sure. No, I don't think it's important. The legislature is full of attorneys, nonpartisan attorneys, partisan attorneys. In a lot of professional associations, there are attorneys as well. I think lobbying is about people. You should have someone who can read statutory language, but you don't need to be an attorney.
I don't think you need to be attorney. I don't think you have to have an attorney. I do happen to have an attorney as a lobbyist. We are a staff of 7 here at the association, and I don't have in-house legal counsel. So he does a part of his contract. He does a little bit of legal work for us unless he has to bring in another associate, and then we may get charged. But he does do some of that for us. I think the biggest value that he brings is that if we want to run a bill, he writes that legislation before it goes to the Bureau of Legislative Research. So we have a really good shell before it gets to them. So that's been very useful. And then now my banks do have, a lot of them do have in-house attorneys, and I pull them in when necessary too, because even though he's an attorney, my contract lobbyist doesn't practice banking law, and they do every day. And so I will utilize them as necessary. But as far as day-to-day relationships, like Jim said, I don't think you have to be an attorney, and you can absolutely do it without an attorney.
Great, thanks you both. Another question, do you utilize your contract lobbyists to monitor bills, or do they just actively lobby on your behalf?
I guess I'll start that. We can just ping pong back and forth, Jim. Mine both monitor bills and they actively lobby on our behalf. I have they each have bill tracking sessions, bill tracking tools, but I also have a bill tracking tools, and I do our weekly reporting based on that. So I look at every bill I think could affect us, and I catch a lot of them. They catch a lot of them. And then we discuss strategy, because they are at the Capitol every day. I also, like I said, I have a staff of 7, so I have to be here at the association, also running the association. I can't be at the Capitol every day. So I use them very heavily to be down there on the ground. And we will discuss anytime an issue comes up, we circle up, we talk about, we put together talking points, assign folks that each of us are going to talk to, and then we go forward that way. But again, I am the head lobbyist, and my executive committee, as well as my government relations committee, helps set the tone on how we're going to lobby, what we're going to lobby for. Usually it's us advising them, and then we have buy-in from them as well, so that if we need bankers to start making phone calls, we can.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Lorrie said, I think it is, a monitoring contract is going to be part of any full-fledged lobbying contract. In some situations with smaller associations, I've seen them hire a lobbying firm just to monitor because they don't have any issue priorities that year, but want to be prepared in case something comes up where they'd have to defend their actions and interests. I think the more people monitoring, the better. So much like Lorrie, I also have national bill tracking software, so I can look at things even in those situations where I'm not the lead lobbyist on it. When I think about the role of a lobbyist in this situation, they don't need to be the issue experts. So our lobbyists often miss wide when it comes to tracking and sending us many more bills than we would ever want to care about. I want them to be the experts in the people at the legislature, just like, you need a lawyer in a courtroom, whether you're innocent or guilty. You should have a lobbyist if you're going to step foot in a state capitol or government agencies. They generally have the tools to track legislation. They need to have the knowledge of the people and the relationships, and perhaps something that's going on some other bill that's going to affect your bill because two members of the assembly aren't getting along, and it threatens, your bill runs the risk of getting caught up in a feud that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, I would add there, Jim, it is a delicate dance when you are, especially when you are running your own bill and you're finding sponsors, to know who's getting along, who's not getting along, the factions within the House and the Senate, and then the factions between the House and the Senate, because there will always be people who are not getting along and are going to get mad if you let so-and-so sponsor your bill, take my name off because I'm not going to be involved in that, or if there's some other bill that might affect you that has nothing to do with you, but because of who the sponsors are. And I'll throw in there too, I mentioned I do all of our federal lobbying. I work very closely with the American Bankers Association. They have the lobbyist on the Hill every day. And those lobbyists are very good about calling me and saying, I'm going into the office for a meeting. What do you have that you may want me to talk about? Or can we have an affiliated PAC? Are you okay with us writing this PAC check? Does that work for you? And so I work very hand in hand with them as well.
Yeah,
And
it's I would also be sure not to make them. I would be sure not to make the mistake of assuming that if your state is largely red or blue, that Democrats get along and with Democrats and Republicans don't. There's a deputy speaker in Connecticut who's been known to say that the Republicans may be the opposition. He's a House member. The Republicans may be the opposition, but the Senate is the enemy, because the chambers often fight for control of that. So another place where I think it's important to bring as many people in as you can. Different folks have different access to information, whether that information be factual about a bill or about these kinds of relationships that we're talking about. Lobbyists often stand around the halls of the Capitol and gossip, not just for the sport of it, but because it can provide you intel when you go to make strategy decisions later on.
great. And we may, this next question, we may have already touched on a couple of things, but in relationship to whether or not you utilize a legislative committee, how does that interaction look like with your contract lobbyist? And maybe speak a little bit about how that looks like with involvement with the rest of your organization. And as Lorrie mentioned, how that might look like if you're partnering with the National Association for federal lobbying purposes.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. Most of my clients have legislative committees or more broadly public policy committees. It's been said that if you're a carpenter with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We don't have to run bills through a legislature to get all the policy changes we made. Lorrie already touched on her relationship with the banking regulators in Arkansas. I think of my public policy committee members as issue experts. 5 of my clients are physical therapy associations. I understand more about physical therapy than I used to, not just because I'm an aging athlete and need physical therapy regularly, but because I've been working with them for close to 30 years. I'm still not one, and I don't have that education. So they need to be able to provide me with that kind of information to understand whether the changes that are proposed are going to work or not in practice. As some of them get more experience, they can also add to that political insight conversation that we were talking about earlier. I would say the one pitfall, the one pitfall you have to be very careful of with a public policy or legislative committee is having it interact too much with the lobbyists that you're actually taking time away from the lobbyists working at the Capitol with legislators and others. The more a lobbyist is reporting back to you, the less they're actually talking to the folks they need to be talking to. And that kind of burden can drive folks away from your organization. In Massachusetts, there was one woman we were talking to about representing us. And after the interview, she called me and said, I'm not interested, because all 12 members of the public policy committee came to the interview and asked her questions. And she was used to working with corporate CEOs where it was a one-on-one relationship and she knew it wouldn't fit there. So, Lorrie?
I do have a government relations advisory committee, and Jim, you're probably your mouth may drop open when I say it has 26 members. But some of them they pick and choose a lot of them as to when they're going to speak up if it's something they have a particular interest or understanding of. My tracking software, I do run a weekly reports. We meet every Friday during session at a specific time. My lobbyists do join that call. However, I lead walking us through the report, and then I have them just add on anything specific about conversations they've had this week. And the three of us get together and brief before that. I also have regional banks that employ their own government relations directors, not necessarily lobbyists, because they sit in another state and they monitor 5 or 6 states. And really the only reason they pay dues to us is because they want to know what's going on at the ground level here, because it obviously affects them as well. So they are also all on the call. And so sometimes you get a lot of feedback about a specific issue and sometimes not, but we have emails that go back and forth too. If I have a bill that I think, I'm not a banker, I've never been in banking. So I may recognize a 5,000 foot level, but I'm going to that government relations committee and saying, what does this mean specifically for our industry? Is this going to get us crossways with federal law? Because we are heavily regulated at the federal level. And so I asked for that specific information because they are the ones, like Jim said, they are the ones that do this every day and they have that knowledge. And sometimes you can have one member go a little bit rogue and want to steer the conversation in a certain direction, and they don't really understand the dynamics of the relationships. And I've had it before where they just want to flip their position about face in the middle. And I say, no, guys, we've made commitments. We can't do that. So I on the backside, sometimes we'll talk to my executive committee and get them to plant certain ideas at work. Sometimes you have to lobby your own committee about the direction that the association is going to go. And so I do that quite often. I do bring my lobbyists in. We have 4 board meetings a year, and I bring them in because we have a government update at each of those meetings. I give the general update, and then I have them fill in anything for that.
Great. Thanks to both. One question that we just got is, do you have any recommendations for issuing an RFP, a request for proposal for hiring a contract lobbyist that you can share?
Jim, you're the expert there.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts on that. The first is I don't like RFPs for lobbyists. I think as a client, as an association, I don't want to open it up to everybody. I want to do my research and try to identify those folks who are the best fit for us. More likely an RFQ, a request for qualifications, maybe saying, why do you think you're the right folks for us? But I will have had a number of conversations by the time I reach out. Think about what lobbyists do for a living, right? They move people, they persuade people. If a lobbyist can't convince you they're the right person for the job, they're not very good at their job. So I would do my own research and talk to other folks that I know in the field to try to narrow the list to a handful of firms, and then reach out to them directly and ask them to put together either a proposal or an RFQ. That's where I'd start.
I did an RFP when I first started here. We used to have an in-house lobbyist. That model I found, and that position was empty when I first started. And so I did a little bit of interviewing for that position. And then it wasn't utilized very effectively. And our state legislature really expects the executive director to be involved, and then supplemented with contract lobbyists. We don't have a lot of associations. Most of our associations here are too small to have an in-house government relations person. And like I said, but that the legislature isn't used to that. They really want to deal with the president, or in my instance, the president, because they feel as if they're dealing with the most important person in the body, I guess. I did do a very short RFP, but much like Jim said, I have friends, thankfully through our state chapter ASAE, I have friends, and I went around and talked to them and said, who are you using? What's the strong point? I called the heads of both of the insurance and commerce committees and talked to them. And the 2 that I went with have been doing this a very long time, and they're very well respected for that. So that was the process I used.
And a related question is, do you recommend a term limit, a time limitation on hiring a contract lobbyist? I mean, I guess that also, really naturally lends itself to, how do you review them? How do you know that it's been successful?
I have an annual evergreen contract that it can be canceled at any time by either side. It's a very, very simple I think half a page agreement. It's just a contract for services. And because I am so very involved with them, I don't really do necessarily an annual review. If something happens during this session and it didn't go the way we wanted to, we talk about it and talk about what happened. I explain what happened to my leadership, and we just keep moving on. And if there was something egregious that happened, we would address it right then.
So most of our lobbying contracts, both for me personally and the ones I manage for clients, are the length of the session of the assembly. So for example, both House and Senate members are elected for 2-year terms in Connecticut. So 2 years is, in Connecticut, it's 2 different short sessions, but it's the same folks in the building. And so my lobbying contract tends to run for a 2-year session. In Massachusetts, it's a full 2-year session. So always, you don't want to be dumping your lobbyists in the middle of a session when they've been doing work, unless something egregious comes up, as Lorrie talked about. As far as managing, I think it is pretty important to make sure expectations for what the roles and responsibilities are put out in advance. And this goes back to hiring, or the RFP question too. What kind of lobbyist are you looking for? Are you looking for somebody who has connections on the Democratic side, the Republican side, of the governor's office, or all of those? Are you looking for someone who's used to work with grassroots organizations or large corporates? What are the strengths and skills? What are they a firm that makes their reputation based on getting legislation passed? Or there are some lobbyists who make a living just killing proposals that are threats to their industry. Any lobbyist will tell you a session where you're playing defense and trying to kill bills is way more fun, because there's a lot of ways to kill bills and only one way to get one passed, which is to get it through both chambers and signed by the governor. So if you've done the work to understand that and come up with a strategy and get it into, again, a very simple contract like Lorrie mentions, you should have frequent conversations so that if you do have a formal review, there are no surprises in the review. Both client and lobbyists know how it's going. That's my experience on both sides of the ledger.
And I think another related question that we got, do either of you have, lobbyist cost ranges? I mean, I know personally, even in my tenure, really depends, on the issue and the duration, but are there some economies of scale as far as like cost? I know, Jim, you work frequently in Connecticut, and Lorrie, you're based in Arkansas, but maybe some things that you've seen.
The one thing I'd say is that most of that's public information now. So you should do research and figure out what is standard for, in a state like Connecticut, which is fairly small, I know lobbyists who make $6,000 to $10,000 a year on a monitoring contract. I know lobbyists who make $500,000 a year on a full-fledged lobbyist contract for the firm. So there's really isn't a range. It depends on who's doing the hiring. But if you look at what folks are paying, you can get a sense of where your organization should fit in. You want the contract. One of my clients has the kind of biggest lobbying firm in their state working for them because there's a personal connection, but they are by far the smallest contract for that lobbyist. And it has proven to be a problem occasionally, because it's really hard for them to pay attention to that client when some of their larger clients are taking more of their time. So you want to be in the sweet spot for the firm that you're hiring.
I also know what several of my fellow executive directors pay my contract lobbyists, and it really, the amount I pay less than they do, but they also have one of their biggest clients is in healthcare. And so they have several regulatory bodies in the state that they are constantly dealing with policy and politics and things like that. And our regulatory body here in the state, we get along with very well, and they are not constantly making regulation, and they don't have rulemaking committees and things like that. And so I pay less than they do because of how often they have to, how often they are in the thick of things with me. And so I think part of it is just a balance of knowing how much, we play more defense than offense. We might run one bill a session, maybe at a stretch two. We do play a lot of defense, but even with that, I am still very, very active in that. So based on how much they have to do with other state entities and how involved I am, that's pretty much what set our amount. And like I said, I do know that I pay less than several other associations who are in associations and other clients who are in healthcare.
Well, and interestingly, I think the one thing I forgot as the moderator to tell you is where I work. I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer for the American Society for Dermatologic Surgery Association. Yes, it's a mouthful. It just rolls off the tongue. But you know, I have helped several state, local derm societies hire lobbyists, and an effective strategy for that is sometimes it's starting with the amount of money that you have. So I've actually helped, you know, people hire by saying, you know, this is the amount the group has. What could you do in a session, you know, for this amount of money? And then it just really helps some of the level setting, especially a new local or state organization just getting into it. And it's sometimes blossomed and, you know, to really good relationships for the future. And then it helps those organizations level set and get their budget in order for what they want to do. And, you know, it really also helps with their agenda setting, because then they can be more realistic with the amount of money that they have, you know, to hire contract lobbyists to get the issue done. So that might be another way that some of the groups consider.
I'll throw in one more thing, Kristin. I have paid a bonus before. If we had a really hard session and they really had to go kind of above and beyond what our normal expectations would be, and we were successful with that, I have paid bonuses before.
That's a great idea.
But just be careful, because in some places it's illegal.
Yes, not here in the state of Arkansas, but maybe
you can't do that in Connecticut. You can't do that in Massachusetts, and I'm not sure about some of the other states. But there are some restrictions on success fees, so to speak. You know, and lobbyists are pretty comfortable with success fees in general, because many municipal lobbying contracts are contingent fees for especially procurement, because in general municipal lobbying hasn't caught up to some of the state lobbying ethics restrictions that Lorrie was talking about earlier.
Well, and this would be a good time.
Know your stuff locally.
Exactly, be a good time, right, for that disclaimer that we are not offering legal advice. We are giving thoughts and suggestions. We've had a couple questions related to how have you handled conflict of interest with your lobbyists? And I think most interestingly, and I've certainly seen in healthcare, what do you do if your contract lobbyist has clients that have opposing positions?
Oh, well, Jim, I'll jump in there. I think the first thing when you're doing the RFP, one of us probably should have mentioned this, is a conflict check. You want to make sure that they should be doing a conflict check, but if they don't, you want to make sure that they do, because you need to know what other clients they do have. And if you are going to have if you have a natural conflict with that client, for me, if the lobbyists were lobbying for credit unions, they're kind of the bane of our existence. So I would have to say, no, I can't bring you on as one of my contract lobbyists. Mine do, like I mentioned before, they do lobby for several other large associations. I would say, I don't know that I've ever had a situation where I was in direct conflict with another one of their clients. We did have a bill this session that we decided we needed to run a second bill to kind of clear up something in that bill that might have been problematic for our banks. It didn't create anything too major, but we decided to run a second bill to just define some things so that it wouldn't be a problem. But I would expect if for some reason we did have some sort of conflict, my expectations would be that we discuss it. And then when we are talking to legislators, that lobbyist puts up front that they have both clients on either side, and here's what this side said, and here's what this side said, and that could be a little utopian on my part, but we're small enough here in Arkansas, I would know if they weren't, but I also step in and lobby that issue probably a little harder than what they do. And that's the good thing about having two contract lobbyists on my side of the house, is that they don't share a lot of clients as far as that goes, and so one may be more heavily utilized than the other.
My experience is similar to that of Lorrie's, with a few exceptions. You know, I think you have to do the homework initially to make sure that you're not going to run into routine conflicts, because that's not a situation anybody wants. You know, there was a question earlier about how long the contract should be, and you know, a year or 2 years. But really, you want to stay with your lobbying team for as long as you can. They build up issue expertise. They build up relationship with your champions. They know where the attacks are coming from. So if you do a little work on the front end to make sure that you're hiring the right firm, it should really reduce the chances of you having conflict. I did have an interesting situation last year with one of my physical therapy clients where our lobbyists came to us and said they had the opportunity to represent an organization that was kind of a splinter group of an organization that has historically been problematic for us. We felt pretty comfortable by the end that they were not going to be active on the issues that we traditionally had been active with them on. So we said to him, sure, let's just write into the contract that if we at some point determine that if a particular issue is a conflict, you will divorce from them on that issue and you won't represent them. And he agreed because we're a larger long-term client of his in Massachusetts, where my firm, where the client has two lobbying firms. We have moved from one firm to the other with a focus because we don't want firm A working on this issue because we think it's too close. So we go to firm B. One of our lobbying firms in Massachusetts represents both physical therapists and the Association of Health Plans. So as you can guess, there are some conflicts there, but they don't represent us on insurance issues. That's why we have two firms. So with a little advanced preparation, you can really reduce the number of times that happens. I've also seen firms then carve out a piece of the contract and hire a second lobby. I've actually been hired to work one issue for a small fee because there's a conflict on it. So with openness and transparency, and remember, the lobbying community tends to know each other really well, and they tend to, we play in Connecticut where I do most of my lobbying. We have a Lobbyists versus Legislator golf tournament, a Ryder Cup format. We routinely go out. Again, not for breakfast, as Lorrie mentioned earlier, but after sessions, we're all friends.
It's good to know. And this is another, I think, interesting question from a national association who has state issues in like 2 to 5 states. Are either of you aware of any firms that, do work across multiple states? That would you recommend doing that as opposed to doing, separate RFPs for each of those states?
Jim, you've probably seen more of that.
Yeah, well, we do it actually. So this is a big, it depends. The question is, how are you going to get the right lobbyists in each of the states? So there are some large organizations, most of them in and around DC, where you can go and find a lobbyist in any state in the country, and they have relationships with lobbyists where lobbyists agree to give that firm a cut in exchange for them referring clients on a regular basis. Some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies use systems like that to put together lobbying teams around the country. Liberty Square, the company that I work for, we have on-the-ground lobbyists in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Maine, and relationships in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. So if you're in that window, we will either represent you or find someone who's good to represent you. And again, as I mentioned, lobbying networks like this exist. So if you have a lobbyist in a state, it's and you're looking to expand to other states, one of the first things I would do would be to talk to my lobbyist and figure out who he or she knows in those other places, because those relationships can be important. And if they've demonstrated they can do good work, again, if you're not pushing toward an RFP, but looking to identify the right people to work with you, they'll have that kind of information. But make sure that there is proof and beyond just a friendship, because these decisions are critical.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have that direct experience, but like I mentioned, I have Wall Street banks and regional banks that are members that have their own government relations folks who are managing 5 different state lobbyists. And I spend probably a little bit more time with them just explaining the dynamics and the relationships, and here's why we might not want to go this direction, or here's why we go that direction. But they rely very heavily on their state associations. But that's the gist of my experience there.
Lorrie, it also could go back to some of the national stuff, right? Like,
yeah,
five of my clients are physical therapy associations. So when I go to the APTA meetings in DC, if they're legislative meetings, they'll often have a bunch of the state lobbyists there. If I know their chapter is happy with them and I have an issue that comes up for another client in that state, I'll call them, find out if they have conflicts, see if they're interested. So again,
Yes.
it's personal networking, similar to what breeds success at the local level.
My peers across the U.S. We do have a national convention for government relations, and we spend an entire session with our peer groups in the other regions to talk about what's happening in your region. Because if it's a state board in Arkansas, if it's happening there, we will be seeing it soon enough. Very, very effective use of our time.
And I think just listening to you all, it reminds me too, working for a national association, it is good to figure out who is working on like issues, because you also can think about that from your RFP. If you know that you have another association that is their client, and a lot of the issues are the same, and a lot of the bills that you're interested in, you have a lot of synergy. I think you realize that it's it can be work that they're already doing, which can be really, really advantageous for you, and can also help you in your RFP and your contracting. Another question that we just got is related to when you're using a contract lobbyist, thoughts on when you ask them to play defense as opposed to asking them to just be introducing, specific bills for that session. What are some of your thoughts on that?
I think I mentioned earlier, we spend a lot more time playing defense than offense, just because everything touches banking. It seems like everything touches banking. And so I spend a lot of time asking for amendments or just flat out lobbying against something. And I absolutely utilize both of my lobbyists to play defense. We divide and conquer. We get together and decide, do we need to activate grassroots and have individual bankers calling? Is it just the committee and we think we can handle it? But we strategize together. We assign specific legislators, and most often that's based on who has the best relationship with that legislator. And we divide and conquer, but we have very specific plans around how we're going to defend something. And like I said, I don't spend all day down at the Capitol, and so they can catch people in the hallway that I may see that night smoking a cigar or something, but they're going to catch them during the day as well. And so we often double up too that way.
Yeah, and I think it's less about playing defense versus offense and more about workload, right? Like playing defense, if you're playing whack-a-mole, it can be really hard, right? If you've got multiple fronts where you're playing defense, that can be a pretty intense contract. Passing a bill is almost always an intense contract, because it really is. You have to build the case, you have to find the champions, you have to avoid the landmines. But defense can, and is often more important, as I'm sure the Arkansas bankers would attest.
And a little bit related, and I heard Lorrie touch on this a bit, how do you involve your grassroots with your contract lobbyist?
Jim, do you want to go? I went first last time. Do you want to go first, or you want me?
Yeah, sure. Again, my grass tops, my influential folks all know my lobbyists. I try to get them not to interact unnecessarily, but I want them to have a relationship. So we make sure the lobbyist is at the golf tournament, and we make sure they're networking with our folks, so that, and again, sometimes with grass tops, it's remembering that someone has a relationships that allows us to deploy it. Some of our smaller clients aren't the best at understanding what their assets are. And so if we can keep these personal relationships, as a lobbyist, I may call and say, hey, doesn't that woman from New Haven know the chairperson of the committee? Let's have them make a call. So that's how I would, and then you deploy both grass tops and grassroots in whatever manner is necessary, right? Like it depends. And you need to know where you can reasonably expect to deliver the punch that counts.
And I'll say I spend every time there's any conference that we have, or maybe a workshop or a school that we put on, I will go in and I always speak about government relations, because as many of you would agree, I think that it's the number one benefit that we offer to our members. And so I am constantly pushing how important that is. Of course, I talk about our PAC a lot too, but I reiterate to them every time, if you don't have that local relationship, please let me come and introduce you. Let's have coffee together. Let's do something, because you need to get to know them before you make the ask. When it is time, I only put out advocacy alerts when it is absolutely necessary, because I don't want people flooding them all the time. But when it is time, we really need you, and we need you to already have that relationship. So I spend a lot of time just educating our members on why it's important, and that when I do ask them to engage, I really need them to. But you know, it's almost like a last resort, because you want to try and settle it on the front end without bombarding legislators without phone calls. But I also tell them, if there's new ones and I meet them, I tell them, if you'll just be upfront with me, if you're a no, I will respect that, and I will move forward. I may every once in a while say something when I see you, and if you tell me a yes, then great. Let's, you know, and if that starts to waver, just let me know. But if you tell me I don't know, or you won't tell me anything at all, then I am going to continue to pester you. So the best way to get me out of your life is just to give me a firm yes or no. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But when we need to crank up the machine, I usually mainly deal with my CEOs, unless I know that somebody else in the bank has a good relationship. I mainly deal with CEOs and executive management, and assign them someone specific to contact. I can look and see I have a system that'll tell me, I do not have a normal grassroots system that others have, but I do have a system that will tell me what bank headquarters are in what districts. And so then I make personal contact with those CEOs or executive managers and ask them specifically, here's who I need you to contact. Here's their contact information. And these are our main talking points. But as we all know, personal stories are the best. And so I ask them to talk to them about how it affects their customers.
Yeah,
Those
one
are great.
other,
Oh, sorry,
one other
Jim.
interesting area with regard to grass tops and grassroots is knowing the legislators and what is prone to move them. For example, I think of the whole legislative world as a big bell curve, where there are people down one end who tend to always support a particular client. There are people down the other end who tend to generally oppose that client, regardless of the issue. They just have a mindset or a bias, whatever you want to call it. And then most folks are in the middle. They actually don't think about you very often. It's just that there's thousands of bills that come through the legislature. Your client just doesn't have one of those. So, you know, sometimes we want to put some grassroots support behind champions so they can crow about being a champion. And sometimes we want to put pressure on a no, not because we think they're going to turn to a yes, but because we want them to know that there is some local opposition to their position in their district, and they may want to keep their head down. Even if they vote no, they don't want to become an outspoken advocate against our interests. So knowing how legislators respond to that kind of pressure and whether they want calls or not is important to delivering grassroots and grassroots strength the right way.
And I think that's all a part of the relationship that Jim has stressed many, many times, knowing them and having that relationship. And I'll also add that I bring in legislative panels for conferences whenever I can, and let them, you know, and one of the questions I ask them is, how do you want to be contacted? Do you want to be contacted by text or by call or by email? And they enjoy talking about that, because it lets them, you know, talk to they love being on the panels. They love having a little bit of limelight. I let them know you've got constituents from this county that are going to be here, and it gives them a chance to talk about how they want to interact with their constituents and what issues are really important to them.
Those are great tips. And I also think too, just something that I'll add from a national perspective, which really reinforces what Jim and Lorrie said, is, you know, making sure that you check in if you're going to do something and help support a state initiative. Make sure that if you have a local chapter, that you are getting their advice about how to do it and some of the relationships, because you know, although I think national associations can and do develop relationships at state levels, it's always great advice to stick with the closest boots to the ground and getting their input and making sure that you're working, you know, synergy with the synergy to get the, you know, we all want the same thing. We want our issue to pass. We want to stop something, and it's always best to get that state advice.
Kristin, I could share a fun story that actually highlights that point.
I'm sure you have many.
So I'm old, but in 1991, I actually, as a lobbyist, wrote that warning you see on toys: small parts may pose choke hazard to children under 3. Connecticut was the first state in the country to pass that law, despite the fact that Lego, which was headquartered in Connecticut, was opposed. And the reason that it passed was because the toy manufacturers of America didn't use Lego to lobby the bill until after it had passed the House and the Senate. They lobbied from their New York corporate headquarters to the committee. They didn't involve Lego, and then finally asked Lego to go to the governor. And the governor responded by saying, "You want me to veto a bill that's going to stop kids from choking?" And despite the fact that Lowell Weicker was willing to sign the first income tax ever into law in Connecticut, he wasn't willing to sign that bill. If they had used Lego at the committee level, I wouldn't have stood a chance. They would have squished me like a bug. But because they made a real big tactical mistake not using one of their big members locally, they let us get enough momentum that we were able to run the bill through, which became the model for federal legislation 3 years later.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's a great story, Jim. We got another question that's kind of it's a good question, a little bit out of the vein. What is your advice about hiring a contract lobbyist to do position statement work? Develop that for your association.
I'll pump that to you, Jim.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea. I think as a general rule, the client knows more about the issues. Now, with that said, I would always run my position papers and fact sheets by my lobbyist to make sure that I wasn't, again, stepping on landmines that could cause problems in the legislature, making sure I wasn't making references that were unique to my industry and not held by the general public. One of the things I mentioned to clients is the advantage I have is I think more like a legislator than I do a physical therapist or member of the general public. Like, that's the environment I live in. So there are some things you say and I go, ooh, you don't want to say that here. That's going to remind people of a vote 2 years ago that divided the chamber in half. So I would use my existing lobbyist as a sounding board for any collateral materials I was still developing for a legislative campaign or an advocacy campaign. But I wouldn't think that having them take the time to research the issue and do the issue would get you the best result.
Yeah, same here. I typically generate most of our talking points and things like that. And that's through a lot of interaction with members, or right now, a lot of federal issues are trickling down to the state level. So I've already dealt with it at the federal issue, and it's just a matter of reforming it for the state issue. And then I circle up with my 2 contract lobbyists and say, okay, here's what I've got. Can you think of anything else? Or like Jim said, is this going to touch on something else that happened 2 years ago that we don't really want to get into? Or sometimes for me, is this going to cause an entity that right now is not a sleeping giant, but is it going to awaken the sleeping giant if we delve off into that vein of something? And that's typically how we do it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I know one thing, that I want to mention that may be obvious to some of you, but some of you that are new to advocacy, there's also government relations consultants, other types of advocacy consultants that I think would specialize for an association, looking for help with position statements. Like maybe it's formatting, maybe it's how you get it research, how you work it up through your volunteer committees. I just would think that, the advice that Lorrie and Jim gave is great. You want to involve them, but I think if you actually wanted that work done, I think you'd probably be better served to look for somebody who specialized more in that. So that just also might be an avenue for the group asking the question. I think we've touched on it, but I want to make sure, because we got this question twice about. So again, if I missed your answers, maybe just reiterate about what type of reporting are you requiring from your contract lobbyists and how frequently?
And I talk to mine when we're in session. We talk every single day, especially more than once a day if there's something really important going on. And a lot of times if one of us is in committee, we are texting the other saying this just happened or that just happened. And, what do we need to do real quick? I need you to text so-and-so on the committee real quick. We are in constant communication, but I track everything in my system as far as any notes or for, against, amend, whatever, because I do produce a weekly report that goes out to the Government Relations Committee before our call. And I also, I feed all of that over onto our website through an interface. And so that goes out to the membership in our newsletter. Every Tuesday, we send out an e-newsletter, and there's a link to that webpage so that our membership, any of our membership, can look at it anytime. We're very transparent about all of it. But my contract lobbyist and I are, especially during session, we are in contact every day, all day.
I would ditto that. And then the only thing I would add is, especially in situations where you're a membership organization, I'm sensitive to the fact, I think, because I am a contract lobbyist, I want to give my lobbyist a chance to speak to some of the members. So we'll get together and say, so, how about during a 5-month session, let's do a monthly blast email out. It's got your name on it. And the less I have to edit it, the more regularly it will go out. So, in those cases, the lobbyists are usually supportive of that kind of a more thorough report that may include some politics and some policy, because you want to make, Lorrie said a couple times, lobbying is one of the biggest things associations often do for their members. So you don't want the level of intensity to be completely between the exec and the lobbyist. That's the best for actually practicing the art of lobbying, but not necessarily the best for getting the organization to value that investment. So figure out the strategy to speak to the membership at large, and then some much less formal, but much more regular communication between decision makers. Because you don't have time to wait for a report. Like, I have a new client that I'm working with right now on something, and he said he was going to Scotland for a few days. And I said, great, just make sure you have text service internationally, because I may not get to wait till you come back. Like I just got a text while we were sitting here from our Commissioner of Administrative Services to ask when I was available for negotiation today. So I was quickly texting back after 1 o'clock.
And I'll throw in too, when we're hot and heavy in the middle of it, like Jim said, you don't have time to go back to your board and say, what do you think? However, if it's a super controversial issue that we're being asked to make major concessions on, or we're about to have to raise hellfire, down upon somebody, I may shoot a quick text to my executive committee and say, this is where I want to go with this. This is where the lobbying team wants to go with this. I need confirmation from you within the next 5 minutes if you are okay with this, because we've got to move right now. Or sometimes we have a little more time, but I do make sure that my leadership are very informed. The last thing I want them to do is get a call from their local legislator with a surprise that they know nothing about. So that's another piece of it too, is just making sure that you're nimble enough. You have a nimble enough system so that you can react accordingly very quickly.
Yeah, I think every is you have to be able to anticipate being in that situation. So I think every organization that does legislative advocacy has to have an emergency drill policy, whatever it is. And I represent a bunch of healthcare professionals. They're going to be treating patients, so I can't always pull them out. So like, what's our process here? Because I may not have. It'd be nice to think you have a day, but you never have a day at the end of the session. You might not even have an hour, and then you have to kind of live on your gut, and it's a scary choice. But if there's one person you can reach out to who's likely to be near or at their phone or desk, at least you can have each other's back when you make that call.
Well, that's great advice. And interestingly and probably fittingly, the last question that we received is about recording availability. And yes, this session is being recorded. We'll make sure to drop the recording into the ASAE, collaborate, or reach out if we can help you. I just really want to thank Jim and Lorrie. I know on behalf of our subcommittee, we knew that there was a lot of practical need for this topic. And I think by the great participation and the number of people on, we affirmed that. So we're also always interested in ideas that we can cover, to educate the advocacy and government relation professional community. So without further ado, I can give everyone back 5 minutes. And again, many thanks to our speakers, to ASAE, and to all of you for making this a really great and interactive session. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Kristin. Thanks, Lorrie. That was fun.
Bye, everyone.